So these are some of my backdrops, and I'm going to show you how I make them, plus I've got detailed instructions on my blog. So there's that colourway, that one, that one, that one, and that one. I've been using this technique called low immersion dyeing for years, and it's a really easy and I'd say quick. You have to wait for the dye to develop, but you get gratification fairly soon and you can get all sorts of beautiful effects. I'll show you some of them. You can keep it simple, you can just use one colour. Even if you do that, you do tend to get sort of variation in tone because of the way that this method works. And it comes in all sorts of colours. You don't have to buy a lot of them. You can just get the primary colours and mix your own shades, but they're not that expensive, and a little bit goes a long way. And these type of dyes that I'm using are called Procyan MX, and they work on all cellulose fibres, so that's anything that's plant-based, so cotton, viscose, rayon, rami, but you wouldn't be able to use it on wool and on 100% silk. But I've used it. Here's a piece for my ribbons, which are a mixture of bamboo and silk. I find it works, it picks up the dye really well, and you can see, I'll put it on this camera, you can see what beautiful effects you can get. I'll hold it up there as well. So if you get something that's a mix and part of the fibre is plant-based, then you should get a good result, but it's always worth experimenting. And I generally use two methods. I either scrunch up the fabric and then you get these sort of diffuse, almost crystal-like patterns. And another technique I use a lot is stripes. So you pleat the fabric, and it can be very fine, like on this one. And I use several different colours with that to get a particular effect. Or you can just use two colours. I think this one was just red and turquoise. But you get where the fabric is folded, the dye tends to wick along those points, but it doesn't go on the other places, so you get more of a delineation. And you can even do that with just one colour. I use a lot of this fabric in my textile work for backgrounds, but you can use it for anything. You could use it for cushion covers, you can make clothes with it. It's a colour fast dye, it can go through the washing machine. I'll talk about that in a minute. So these are some more of my samples. That's a rather, and you can have really, they tend to be quite bright in the pot, but you can either mix them with a more grungy colour, or you can just use them in a smaller concentration to get some more subtle effects. So sort of any colours possible, really. So all you need to actually buy is soda ash, which is quite cheap, and that's going to be your fixing agent. This is what creates the bond between the dye and the fabric, so that it's going to fix and not fade after a few weeks. And then these are how the colours come. They mostly come in these little bottles. And if I was just starting from scratch, I mean, you could just buy one dye, and I haven't quite decided. I might just use one colour today to show you the effects you can get with that. But if I was starting again, I would start with 3 primary colours in both warm shades and cool shades, and then you can mix absolutely anything with those. And you can buy black. I mean, this one's called warm black because it's a slightly browny black. I never use pure black, I always mix it with something, but sometimes it's a good way if you want a darker colour. And what you have to do is there are different ways of doing this. Just to say, I'm not an expert on this. There are lots of people who are, and I've got books by some of them. So if you want to know more about it, please look up those resources. But this is just what I found works for me, and I have, as I say, I have been doing it for years now. And I am going to put on gloves. None of these are nasty or toxic or anything, but as you know, handling anything, it's good practice to wear gloves. And the first thing you have to do is mix up some soda ash, and you can either pre-soak your fabric, or you can actually soak your fabric with the soda ash and mix the dye into it. But first of all, you have to make it up, and I'll put the formula below. I tend to use this jar, which I've labelled soda ash so it doesn't get mixed up with anything else, although I keep it in a cupboard of all my dye stuff. And I know that for this jar, I need just over a tablespoon full of soda ash. And if you mix it with warm water, it just kind of dissolves a bit. And it's not an exact thing. If it's slightly under or slightly over, it's not going to make that much difference. So then I just pour my water in. So then you give it a good stir, or if you're sure your top is watertight, you can give it a shake. And this, once you've made this up, it will keep indefinitely. So you don't have to make it up and use it that day or even use it that week. And if you use, so I quite like to do the method where you soak the fabric in the soda ash liquid, and then you kind of wring it out, because then you can bottle what's left over and reuse it. Whereas obviously if you're using it in your dye bath, you can't. So that's the first step, and as I say, it's quite a good idea to let it settle for a little bit, but you can use, I have used it straight away. So I'll come on to the next step in a minute. And just to explain the difference between the sort of dyeing I use and what's called batch dyeing. That's when you're dyeing a piece of cloth or some clothes and you want to get as even an effect as possible. And that involves heat, and that involves moving the fabric a lot so that nothing settles in any of it. We're kind of doing the opposite here. These Procyon dyes you use with cold water, and the method I use is that I scrunch up the fabric, pour the dye on, and then you can agitate it a bit, depends what effect you're going for, but the way that the fabric is folded affects how the dye floods through the fabric, which is why you can get, that's how you can get all these almost sort of crystalline effects. And that one I can't quite remember, but I think that one had more than one lot of dyeing. I quite often do that. I'll do the first lot and then the colour isn't quite what I wanted, or I just don't really like it. You just do the whole process again. And I know I should be more systematic about it and weigh out everything exactly, but I'm a little bit more haphazard than that, and I guess because I've been doing it for a long time, I can kind of judge how much to use. That's why, again, I'd say find a book or an expert if you want to go down a more accurate route. But I have these pieces of paper with all the different dyes I've got to show what their colour are. And you'll be surprised how bright, you can see how bright and vivid they are here, but then that's kind of using them almost pure. So you can, and I've got a lot of these grungy colours. I use the taupe a lot because I like to sort of take down the brightness. But it is a good idea to do this. As I say, if I was more systematic, I'd have a proper book and lots of samples of different fabric and everything. That is a nice idea. Maybe if I have some time, I'll do that. And as I said, you don't have to get all these different colours. And what you do find sometimes is that if you go away from the pure primary colours, the mixes that you get, say if you went for, I don't know, this aqua, which is quite a sort of bluey green, what you might find during the dye process is that if it's made of more than one pigment, the pigment kind of disperses. So you might get some elements that are a bit more blue and some that are a bit more green. And sometimes you get colours you can't really understand how they're in that mix, but that's just kind of how they make up the dyes. So you can see why it's a very different process from getting an all over even colour, because you're going to get unexpected results. And I have to say, I never get tired of seeing the finished results. And one thing, it will be the most exciting ironing you've ever done, because once you've rinsed out the fabric, it's easier to iron it from wet, because then you get a smoother finish. And it's only as you iron and it dries that the true colour emerges, and that's I just always get a thrill out of that. So now I'm going to take I like to, when I'm just using quite a small piece today. You know, I have done these large pieces. It's exactly the same process. I just thought a smaller piece would be easier to show on camera. And I'm just going to, I put it in something fairly flat so it can, to make sure that the soda ash gets all over it. You can scrunch it up, but I just quite like, at this stage, I quite like to have it laid flat so I can see that the fabric's absorbed. And I won't have to use all this, but as I said, you can harvest it. So I'm just making sure that every little bit is under the fabric, and you just need to leave that for about I tend to leave it for about 20 minutes or so. So I will do that and come back and show you the next stage. Hello, so it's been about 20 minutes, half an hour, and I'm going to show you how I mix up the dyes. You can mix it in anything. I quite often use jam jars. I got these measuring jugs in various sizes, which are quite good because you can be more precise. If you want to be really precise, you can put it in these squirty bottles if you want to, you know, put dye in a particular area. But I'm just going to show with these jugs today. And again, there probably are proper formulas that you're supposed to use for mixing up the dye. I kind of do it by eye, but you need quite a small amount. I've got these very small measuring spoons, which I must give a bit of a clean, because that's one thing. The pigment is so concentrated that if a little bit gets in the wrong place, you're going to disturb the colour. And you want to, when you work, you want to wear an apron, wear gloves and cover your work surface, because it does tend to, as I say, you just need to get a little bit in the wrong place and it can make a mess. So I'm going to use two colours today. I'm going to use an olive green and a turquoise because I really like blues and greens together. Now this is surprising. You look at the olive green and it actually looks sort of reddish brown in the thing. So, but you can see by the colour that's gone on the lid that it is actually green. So that's what I was saying about the mixes can be made up of surprising colours. And that means you want to really mix it well before you add it to your dye bath. And I'm just going to use, I think the turquoise is very bright, so I am going to muddy it a little bit with, I've got a lot of this taupe, which is just a sort of, you know, greyish brown. So for the, I'll do the olive green first, but I only need small amounts because I'm only doing a small amount of fabric, so I'm not going to make up much now. I'm going to use this, which is 1/32 of a teaspoon, but I am going to, as I say, I do it roughly. So that's the olive green, and for the other colour, I'm going to do less. I'm going to do half and half. So I'll use the next size down, and I'll use the taupe first, and I might be being too abstemious here, but we'll see. And then you just want to mix some warm water because that helps the dye disperse better. So I've got some warm water here. As I say, I'm only working in small amounts, so I don't need that much. And then you have to really mix. I quite like using, I think these came from a cheap sort of cocktail set, but they're good because they really, you want to stir longer than you think, because as well as mixing the colour properly together, the other thing you'll find is that if there might be a bit of, if you get a bit of powder that hasn't dissolved on the fabric, it can be quite noticeable. Depends what you're doing. Sometimes you're not going to mind about that, but if it was something where you wanted a really clear finish, that could be a bit annoying. And then what I always do, I've got a bit of scrap paper. I'm going to test the shades out. See, that's the turquoise. Maybe that's a little bit on the wimpy side. I might add a little bit more. See, both those are quite light, so I'm going to add a little bit more. More turquoise. More the taupe. And then more of the olive green. And again, give those a really good mix. I find especially if you're doing that, if you're adding the water to the powder, it kind of disperses more easily. If you're adding the powder to the water, you have to be really careful that it's mixed. So I'm going to do the same thing again. Let me move this over. So you can even see on that piece of paper how the colour is slightly breaking up, and you can see a bit of orange in it. Yeah, you can see that's a richer colour now. And because I tend to do just one piece at a time, I find this is an adequate way of doing it. If you're doing a lot, if you're doing larger quantities, I think you'd have to be more systematic about it. But I find this works very well for me. So I'm going to move that to one side. And then I'll bring back the soaked fabric. And so I don't know if you remember, I said that you can. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to just get rid of the excess, not completely, and then I can later on I'll pour this back into the jar and I can use that for some more dye. And the way, because you want to, if you want to get the sort of crystalline, interesting patterns, you have to pack the fabric into something quite small. And I tend to keep microwave containers of all shapes and sizes. I'm going to use, I probably don't need to use something this big, but I think it will show on camera better if I do it in something big. And what I tend to do is, because it was folded, and I don't want it folded for this particular batch, I'm going to just scrunch it up. And the more you scrunch it up, the more interesting patterns you're going to get. So, and it actually is, I find it's easier to, you know, you can do this on dry fabric, add your soda ash and then, but I find it sort of scrunches better while it's sort of wet like this, it sort of stays into position. So you can see how small that is. In fact, I think I am going to use one of these just to show that you can do it in such a, that's all you need, that's all you need. So you can see how that's really packed in tight. And the reason it's called low immersion dyeing, because you haven't got a big vat, you only need a little bit. And what you can do, you get to know which fabrics, I mean, blue, turquoise, they talk about striking in dyes. That's when the sort of dye starts binding with the fabric. And some colours are more sort of fugitive, not really fugitive. Some are just stronger than others, and I find that turquoise goes really quickly. So if I'm using that with another colour, I always use the first colour. So there are different ways you can do this. I do a mixture. I let some of it go in the bottom, and then I dribble some of it. And it might depend. It depends whether you want to have some white in it or whether you want it to be completely. And although I don't want to agitate it too much because that will make it the colours too blocky, I do want to make sure it's going through. So I might just turn that over. Yeah, I think that's okay actually. So I'm just going to put the rest in the bottom and then give this one more stir. And then I'm going to put some in the bottom. And you see, because the fabric's wet, it draws up the dye. So even if you just put it in the bottom, quite a lot of it would be able to draw itself up into the rest of the fabric. Right, so now the most important thing is not to agitate it now because you want to get the nice patterns. And you leave it for, I have done it different. When I've been really, really desperate for something, I've left it even an hour and it's been okay. But I tend to leave it for at least 4 hours, and that's why it's 11 o'clock now, so I'm going to leave this until this afternoon. It doesn't matter if you leave it longer. I mean, overnight's really good if you can wait that long, but I'm too impatient for that. And it wants to be somewhere sort of room temperature. It's got to be, I'll write this below, I'm not sure exactly, but it has to be above a certain temperature to work properly. So if you were out in a outhouse or a garage or something where it's quite cold, you'd want to bring it in to a room and do it so that it can be a decent temperature. And the other thing is you want to keep it quite moist while it's working. So the best thing is just to use this, just a plastic bag. You just have to drape it over there, and then you just have to wait. So I will come back to this afternoon and show you the result. Hello, so it's now later in the same day. It's 20 to 4, so that's been nearly 5 hours, so that should be fine. And here it is. So I'm going to unveil it. So what I'm going to do now is rinse it in cold water until pretty much most of the dye is washed out. And if I'm doing a large piece like that, I usually run it through the washing machine on a quick wash, but because it's just a small bit, that will be fine just to do it by hand. And it doesn't matter what detergent you use, but I do sometimes, especially if I am doing a big piece or a dark piece that's got lots of dye in it, I use this called, well, there are several ones, Coal Spurse. It's a dispersal agent, so it works better than a regular detergent for getting rid of the dye, and you only need the tiniest amount, especially if you're putting it into a washing machine. Honestly, just 1 or 2 drops and you'll get lots of bubbles. So I'll do that now, and then I'll bring it back and I will iron it dry, and you'll see the patterns that have emerged. So see you in a minute. Right, so I'm just getting my little ironing board out, and I've just wrung it so it's sort of hand, wrung it out to get most of the excess moisture out. And you just put your ironing on whatever setting your fabric is. So if I was doing the silk, I'd do it obviously on a lower setting, but I've got it on the cotton setting. And you'll see that it makes such a difference. Sometimes things look sort of quite dark and muddy, and then you iron them. I must admit though that this, I'm not sure I would call this colour olive green. I haven't used this one very much. And it does kind of teach you that you should do a bit of testing first if it was for something important. I mean, I like it, and I really like it with the turquoise, but I do think it's more a sort of rusty colour, which thinking about it, my last sketchbook, if you saw that, where I was sort of preparing one before doing some work in it, had quite a lot of these colours in it. I do find that I return to, even without knowing it, even subconsciously. So even here, I thought I was getting green, but I'm actually getting a rusty colour. See, it looks when it's damp, it looks greener, doesn't it? But as it's iron dry, it gets much warmer. But you can see now, as it's sort of crisper, that there's some lovely patterns in it. So that's where the dye has sort of wicked up the scrunched up bits, and you get such lovely interesting textures. And I sometimes find if I do a piece and I don't like it at all, or it's come out too pale or just too boring, I'll do it again with probably some different colours. Sometimes there'll be a fabric and bits of it I really like and other bits I don't, so you can cherry pick and use them. I sometimes do a bit of patchwork, or even things like putting a binding on a quilt, and it might be just the right colours for that. So it's always, nothing's ever a disaster, is it? And it's just such fun playing with colour. And this is definitely my favourite sort of ironing. I hate ironing normally. That's why I mostly wear jersey things, so I don't have to. And there are just one or two little specks I can see. You know, I was talking about how when the powder, I don't know if that shows up in camera, there's one sort of slightly purple spot. Always seems to be purple for some reason, whatever colour you're dyeing. But they're tiny, so they're not going to worry me. Just turn it over and do. And you do find sometimes that it can look slightly different on one side than the other because of the way that it was in the dye bath. So that's something to bear in mind as well. Right, that's nearly done. That bit's not completely dry, but that's fine. Switch the iron off. I have to be very careful because on that socket there, there's a double socket, and the other one is where the internet's plugged in. And it has been known for me to switch that off. Okay, so here's the finished result. And I think you'll see that you've got some really interesting patterns and colour mixes, and just kind of how fun that is as a way of making unique, one-of-a-kind fabrics. So I hope that was helpful. I'll put a few instructions and other resources down in the description box because, as I say, I'm not an expert. This is just how I've sort of developed the way I do it. And I'll put in a few pictures of some of the other fabrics that I've done, and you can see what a huge variation there is. So thank you so much for watching, and join me again soon.